The quote-unquote tempo style deck archetype gets thrown around a lot when people are describing decks that generally have just a disruptive game plan, but it doesn't always hit the same mark that the title really strives to achieve. True tempo decks always try to balance timely spells and aggressively costed creatures to try to end the game before their opponent can really turn the tides in the favor of what their deck actually wants to do. Unfortunately, a lot of these decks have kind of been hated out of the Pioneer mid-game and kind of pushed out of the scene in general, but fortunately, Hero Sukai hasn't stopped trying to get them to work, and over the weekend, their Mono Blue Spirits deck took second in a Pioneer Challenge. Now, you may be familiar with its Azorius cousin version of the deck, however, the Mono Blue version was probably one of the more popular versions very early on in Pioneer's lifespan, competing with the Azorius and Bant versions to be the most played Spirits deck in the format. The deck looks to leverage what some players may describe as the more annoying parts of the blue color pie. It has small evasive creatures, cheap card draw, and cheap soft counter magic that more taxes your opponents than countering the spells outright, and most of these can be done at instant speed. All of these cards create small advantages that kind of compound upon one another that demonstrate what the more classic definition of a tempo deck really and truly is. However, if the deck loses that tempo control and the real grasp of the game, so their opponent is able to actually play on curve or resolve something bigger and more powerful than what the Spirits deck can do, it's an uphill battle. The core of our deck is the Spirit creature type, which allows us to play all sorts of small yet strong creatures. Spectral Sailor is probably the quintessential one that you think of when you hear about Spirits, as the 1/1 flying creature has flash, so you can hold up mana for interaction on your opponent's turn, and then flash it in, while later it also allows you to draw a card while playing in pretty much the same exact way. Supreme Phantom draws upon the Kindred theme of the deck, giving all of our small creatures a bit of an extra boost, letting them hit harder and sometimes dodge removal spells with the increased toughness. When the extra padding isn't enough to survive, Rattle Chains comes into play in order to give our creature hexproof, fizzling the spell entirely. Sticking around lets us play all of our spirits at instant speed, making decisions for our opponents even harder when we pass the turn with open mana and a Rattle Chains in play. Mausoleum Wanderer is another one-drop spirit that serves a dual purpose, growing with each other spirit we play for a turn, and being a sort of heads-up way to counter our opponent's spells, mostly the removal kind. Shacklegeist is our best option at finding an opening to attack through opposing blockers, as none of our spirits are truly unblockable despite them being incorporeal. Tapping two of our small things to lock down a bigger threat makes combat a pain for opponents both on the defense and when they try to go on the offense. Brazen Borrower isn't a spirit, so it's a bit of a combo breaker here, but the adventure side Petty Theft is one of the best ways to imitation time walk an opponent after they finally do wind up resolving a large threat, while the flying aspect of Brazen Borrower's 3-power body is relevant to our clock. The last creature in the list is another 1-drop, and half of the reason why we're running Snowlands in this deck, which we'll get to later on, and that card is Ascendant Spirit. This blue version of Figure of Destiny, for all those old fogies out there like me, can become a big problem quickly for opposing decks, especially since its ability to quote-unquote level up into a bigger creature can be done at instant speed. Even if we don't put any other creature on the board, this little 1/1 can make its way all the way up to a 6/6 flying that draws a card as early as turn 4, although we usually do have other things we want to play. Now, one thing of note in Hero's most recent list is a smaller spell package overall, going down to just 6 instants, 4 enchantments, and 2 artifacts. The normal counter magic package has been trimmed down to seemingly just the most relevant effects in its main deck, and there are no actual card draw spells here like Consider. There are just 4 copies of Geistlight Snare and 2 copies of Spell Pierce. Geistlight Snare is the best in slot counter magic for this deck specifically because it's almost always going to be 2 mana and sometimes just 1 mana for basically a mana leak. Although No More Lies exists now, not having to splash an additional color and the small upside of being even cheaper makes Snare the choice for spirit decks built this specific way. Spell Pierce is not only great into the control and combo decks, but it also has game against Rakdos Vampires in Game 1 as a way to counter an on-curve Sorin, delaying their best possible play of Sorin Tell. The 4 Curious Obsession are in the deck, giving it its real tempo kind of feel, as this card gives a creature +1/+1 and allows us to draw a card for just 1 mana, as long as we connect. It does, however, have the stipulation that if you have an attack this turn, the enchantment will die at the end of that turn. That means it's an extremely good early game play, but not always one that plays catch up all too well. If we aren't using our spells to seize control of the speed of the game, then, well, our curiosity will never be satisfied. Now, the most recent addition to this deck are the 2 copies of Cryptic Coat, which has been popping up in Standard and some other lists to really hinder decks that can't answer artifacts all that well. Not only does the coat give +1/+0 and that coveted can't be blocked clause, playing amazingly with Curious Obsession by the way, but the card can be returned to our hand ad nauseum, giving us an army of 2/2s with Ward. The only downside? We can't equip the card manually, so we're kind of hoping that we flip over into a larger toughness Spirit or Ascendant Spirit card so that the coat gets the most value possible out of the unblockable clause on it. However, turning extra lands in our deck into 2/2s is also amazing value for us, so the card makes a lot of sense to be in this deck. Our land base, as I mentioned, is 18 Snow Islands, mostly for the Ascendant Spirit, but also to turn on the Snow Mutavault itself, Faceless Haven. Once banned in Standard for being just too strong, Faceless Haven is statistically the strongest spirit in our deck without being pumped up by other effects, at a 4 power and 3 toughness stat line, which does grow alongside our Supreme Phantoms. Better than Mutavault for the stat line and the fact that it creates snow mana for our Ascendant Spirit, Faceless Haven has been a staple in the mono-colored version of the deck pretty much since its release. A singleton Odawara is in the deck to mimic what Brazen Borrower can do, but it also has the ability to save our own things in a pinch. Now, one stark omission from our land base is Cavern of Souls. This land would seem like a no-brainer in a deck that doesn't want its things to be countered on dealt with on the stack. However, because of the snow mana requirements and just the general aggressive nature of our land base, we're not going to be able to fit Cavern of Souls into this list without having to make some sacrifices elsewhere. Instead, we need to try to play our threats more intelligently while we have our own interaction to back them up, rather than relying on the Cavern of Souls uncounterability clause. Now, our sideboard is where things do shake up a little bit, although we do have some extra copies of Cryptic Coat for grindier games and another Faceless Haven for when we need to go longer in the game and add extra lands for some of the larger spells that we bring in. Those large spells we bring in are mostly the 2 copies of Blue Sun's Twilight, which has long fought for spots next to March of Swirling Mist in this 75. While March can be used to dodge board wipes, the deck already has a pretty decent control matchup if you play it right. The Blue Sun's Twilight allows you to seal away opposing creatures rather than just evading them for a turn. Although it requires a lot of mana to do so, with 3 mana needed to just steal a 1 mana creature, it often won't be played early on, and by the time you need X equals 3 or more, it could just be closing out the game, so that makes it a very worthy investment. Extra counter magic is all in the sideboard now, including 2 copies of Lofty Denial, which works for all of our threats except for an unevolved Ascendant Spirit or activated Mutavault, while 2 Invasive Surgery and 1 Miscast come into combat combo and control decks specifically. While we might not be able to get Delirium with a ton of consistency, when we do get it, we can make sure that we take away all those pesky hidden strings from Lotus Field decks or things like Farewell from control. Now, anti-Amalia card Grafdigger's Cage only has 1 copy in the deck, which seems alright with a few other ways to slow the combo down until we find a way to just shut it off entirely. Meanwhile, 3 copies of Unlicensed Her sound like a lot to be running, but I'm not going to question Hero's intuition as they played the deck for as long as I can remember, which is about an infinite amount of more times than I have. However, I do identify that Hearse is a needed card against the Phoenix matchup. So if this deck struggles as hard as I think it will against that Is It Phoenix deck, then this makes perfect sense to be running 3 of them for. Lastly, a singleton copy of Reckoner Bankbuster slots in against the grinding matchups and control decks, so you can keep your own card advantage up. Now, the deck as it is right now doesn't really have a ton of data points for us to really base a concrete feel of how it shakes out in the current metagame. However, it was played in previous metagames quite a lot, so we do have a good indication of how it would perform or what type of metagame it would actually want to thrive in to do well. Looking at the pre-Karn ban numbers, Mono Blue Spirits was favored against a lot of the combo and big mana decks of the format, including surprisingly good numbers against Abzan Greasefang and Mono Green Devotion. It was a menace against the Lotus Field combo decks and the control version, which have been seeing a little bit more play recently, at least the combo one, and would be a big reason to sleeve up this version of Spirits. Creativity and Enigmatic Fires were also winning matchups for this deck. However, the deck struggled against the Rakdos and Phoenix decks at the time, which are still just as big today as they were back then. And they have upgrades. Convoke and some of the other aggro decks, including its cousin Azorius Spirits, were difficult to keep up with, and therefore it led to more bad matchups for the deck. Although it isn't the same exact deck philosophy, we can assume that the Boros Heroic deck is also in this category, although probably not as bad as the Convoke deck, as the Go Tall versus Go Wide allows Mono Blue to have some more avenues of winning available to it. One other thing that this deck has going for it is that with Rakdos swapping to the Sorin Vein-Ripper combination, it has lines that play a little bit more like a combo deck rather than the traditional Rakdos shell. So the percentages on that matchup may skew a little higher towards Mono Blue just based on the type of hands that Rakdos may be inclined to keep now. The Amalia combo deck is probably the biggest threat for this Mono Blue version of Spirits, since the Amalia deck not only puts up a game-ending combo, but also gains so much life that any concept of tempo can kind of get thrown out the window, even if the deck isn't in threat range of comboing. Overall, it is interesting to see Mono Blue Spirits pop up again when I feel like at least 3 of the top decks in the format are really difficult matchups for the deck to beat. While I do think the deck can find a way to win against favored deck matchups against it with a skilled pilot, it's also extremely punishing of a deck to play, as your minor misplays and your suboptimal lines really compound up quickly to punish you. Even when you're in a favored matchup, it could be the difference between winning and losing depending on the spell that you use on turn 2, maybe putting you in a situation where you don't have the correct one for turn 4 or 5 down the road to answer that specific threat. I would only suggest the deck for players willing to play it for prolonged periods of time, so you can just learn all of your lines and understand what spells are most impactful against what opposing decks, or if your metagame is full of combo-centric decks like Lotus Field, or even if you see some Abzan Greasefang at your LGS. I'm also less inclined to go into this version of the deck over the Azorius version, because they can just splash for spot removal like Get Lost, and creatures like Skyclave Apparition, which is also a spirit, to remove problems from the opposing side of the board. It does just seem stronger at answering things rather than hoping you can prevent them for a turn or two and survive. So, how does everybody feel about the Mono Blue Spirits deck? Let me know in the comments below if it's something you're looking to try out, or if you think it's just more of a flash in the pan for a challenge like this one. As always, thumbs up the video if you'd enjoyed it, and make sure to tap that subscribe button for more deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general, Magic content. See you later.